3 months pregnant, my husband dragged me to entertain a client over drinks. That night, I lost my baby. Meanwhile, my best friend gave birth to her son, and my husband was by her side the whole time. They lived off me, drained me like parasites, and humiliated me for not being able to bear children. They even schemed to take my father's inheritance and divorce me so he could make my best friend his wife. But when I threw the paternity test in their faces, the child turned out not to be his. And just like that, they turned on each other, tearing each other apart like rabid animals. Derek and I had been college sweethearts for 3 years. He adored me and treated me like a queen. After graduation, we got married. I lost my mom when I was a child. My father, who had been deeply devoted to her, never remarried. He raised me on his own all these years. Though my dad wasn't fond of Derek, he accepted him for my sake. Derek came from humble beginnings. When we got married, my dad didn't ask for a dowry and even gifted me a $10 million estate as part of my dowry. He also took care of every detail of our wedding. After we got married, Derek joined my family's company. My father, knowing I wasn't interested in business, treated Derek as his successor and mentored him. To his credit, Derek proved capable, achieving notable results within just 3 years. When my father passed away 6 months ago, Derek fully took over the family business. Already a busy man, he had become even more occupied in the months since I barely saw him at home anymore. Derek never let me accompany him to his business engagements or involve me in work matters. But today, for $1 million deal, he decided to bring me along. "Emily, this is Nathan." He introduced me to the overweight man before us. I nodded politely. "Mr. Nathan, nice to meet you. I'm Emily, Derek's wife." Nathan gave me a lingering look, his yellowed teeth on full display. "Miss Emily, what a pleasure to meet you. We actually met before at your father's funeral 6 months ago." Time flies. You're even more stunning now than I remembered. I froze for a moment. There were so many people at the funeral that I had no recollection of him, but his demeanor made me uncomfortable nonetheless. I forced a polite smile and chose not to respond. While Derek discussed the deal with Nathan, I sat quietly with my best friend, Sophie. She had been my college roommate and once saved my life. We were very close. After graduation, she returned to her hometown for 2 years. A year ago, she moved back to the city. She hadn't worked during those 2 years, so finding a job was tough without experience. I asked Derek to hire her, and she became his assistant. Despite being 9 months pregnant, she had to attend this meeting because she had been managing this deal from the start. If it went through, her commission would be substantial. "Miss Emily, with such a legendary businessman for a father, I'm sure you inherited his sharpness, including his drinking skills," Nathan said, raising his glass. "How about a toast?" Just as I was about to decline, Derek chimed in. "Of course, Nathan. My Emily can definitely hold her liquor. Emily, let's have a drink together." He glanced at Sophie and added, "Sophie's pregnant, so she'll toast with tea instead." I froze. "She's pregnant, but wasn't I also pregnant?" "Derek, I'm 3 months pregnant too." Nathan's expression darkened. Derek picked up the wine bottle and leaned close to me. "Emily, just this once, please. You're past the first trimester. 1 drink won't hurt," he whispered. Without waiting for my response, he poured a full glass of wine and pushed it into my hand. "Nathan, here's to you." A chill ran down my spine. I slammed the glass onto the table. "I'm sorry, I'm not feeling well. I'll head home now." Sensing the tension, Sophie quickly grabbed her glass and walked over. "Nathan, please don't take offense. Emily's just a bit temperamental. I'll drink with you." Before she could take a sip, Derek snatched the glass from her hand, his face a mix of anger and concern. "Sophie, are you crazy? You're about to give birth and you're drinking? Do you want to harm yourself?" Watching his panic, I felt a growing sense that something was off, though I couldn't quite place it. Sophie tried to reclaim the glass, but her unsteady movements caused her to stumble into Derek's arms. He instinctively held her close. Even in my slow realization, I knew something wasn't right. "Sophie, sit down," I said firmly. She struggled to straighten herself and quickly left Derek's embrace. "Emily, I didn't mean to, I just twisted my ankle," she stammered. I gave the two of them a long, hard look before letting out a sigh. Gently placing my hand on my belly, I silently apologized to my baby. "For the sake of your dad and Aunt Sophie's business deal, I have no choice but to endure this." "Nathan, here's to you," I said, raising my glass. One drink led to another, and before I knew it, I had downed far too many. Out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw Derek touching Sophie's thigh. I shook my head and looked again, but it seemed like nothing had happened. I was so tired. My eyelids drooped and I lost consciousness. When I woke up, I was greeted by a greasy, bloated face just inches away from mine. "Nathan?" I pushed him away and sat up. "A hotel?" Looking at the dim, suggestive lighting in the room, my mind went blank. "Why am I here? Where's Derek?" Nathan stumbled back when I shoved him, and the towel around his waist slipped to the ground. That grotesque sight flashed before my eyes, leaving me frozen in shock. "Sweetheart, tonight, I'm your husband." He lunged at me. I shook my woozy head and rolled to the side. He missed, turned back, licked his lips, and grinned at me lecherously. "Interesting. I like feisty little wildcats like you." I threw a pillow at him. Taking advantage of the moment he was distracted, I bolted for the door. But before I could make it, he grabbed me by the waist and threw me back onto the bed. His heavy body pinned me down, leaving me unable to move. "Nathan, you'd better let me go right now. If you don't, I'll call the police." I thought my threat might work, but he just sneered. Raising his hand, he ripped open the buttons on my blouse. "Call the police? After tonight, let's see if you dare." Suddenly, my chest was exposed. His breathing grew heavy, and his hand reached for me. I screamed and struggled beneath him, writhing desperately. In my panic, I managed to kick him hard between the legs. He groaned in pain and let go of me. I seized the chance to scramble off the bed, but before my feet could touch the ground, he yanked me back by my hair. "Let me go, Derek, help me." He leaned in close to my ear and growled, "You dare kick me, you little bitch? You should feel honored I even want you." "Still thinking about Derek, your coward of a husband?" The moment I suggested it, he didn't hesitate to agree to hand you over to me for some fun. "Tonight, I'm going to show you no mercy." As he spoke, he reached down to tear at my dress. I clung to it desperately, but he slapped me hard across the face. Dazed, I still refused to let go. I flailed my hands wildly, accidentally scratching the corner of his eye. He yelped in pain and retaliated with several more slaps. My resistance seemed to enrage him further. "You little bitch. I do like wildcats, but one that scratches its owner? That's bad behavior." He dragged me off the bed and onto the floor. Pain shot through me as his fists and kicks rained down. I tried to protect my stomach, but it was no use. Soon I felt a sharp pain in my lower abdomen, and warm wetness spread between my legs. "No!" I let out a piercing scream, and he stopped. Seeing the blood pooling beneath me, panic spread across his face. Suddenly lucid, he scrambled to his feet and bolted out of the room. Moments later, Derek arrived, with Sophie in tow. I didn't have time to wonder how they got here so quickly. All I felt was fear. This child was the one I had longed for over 3 years. I was naturally cold-bodied, and the doctor told me I wasn't suited for pregnancy. To conceive this baby, I had endured countless rounds of herbal treatments and acupuncture. I had gone through endless tests and appointments. but now I could feel my baby slipping away from me. I cried out in despair, "Derek, save our baby!" I reached out to him with blood-covered hands. His eyes were filled with panic. He started to crouch down, but Sophie suddenly clutched her stomach and doubled over. "Derek, my stomach hurts so much." He turned away from me and supported her. "Sophie, what's wrong?" The worry on his face seemed far more genuine than when he had looked at me. "Derek, I think I'm going into labor. Please, take me to the hospital." He held her tightly. "Hang in there, Sophie. Nathan already called 911. The ambulance will be here any second." I curled up on the floor, staring lifelessly at the two of them embracing. At that moment, they looked like the real married couple. I suddenly understood everything. I closed my eyes, but the tears wouldn't stop flowing. We were taken to the hospital. In the ambulance, Derek never let go of Sophie's hand. As for me, no one paid me any attention. When we arrived at the hospital, Derek didn't even glance my way. When I was wheeled into the operating room, he wasn't there. When I woke up, the room was empty. The nurse told me the baby was gone. Seeing how heartbroken I was, she tried to comfort me. "Doctor, where's my family?" She hesitated. "There was no one with you when you arrived at the hospital." After a moment, she added, "Actually, the couple who came in with you paid your medical bills." The pregnant woman was frightened and went into early labor. Her husband was so anxious, pacing outside the operating room. I clenched my teeth in hatred. "Derek, you are truly heartless." I told the nurse I was tired, and she gave me a sympathetic look before leaving. I dialed Derek's number, and before long he arrived. Why? I stared at him intently, and he couldn't meet my gaze. I grabbed the tissue box from the table and hurled it at him. He tilted his head to dodge it and walked over to the edge of the bed. "Emily, I've fallen in love with Sophie." My fingers gripped the blanket tightly. "Since when?" "Derek, haven't I been good enough to you?" His eyes flickered. "Emily, you've been wonderful to me, and I do love you. But all these years you haven't been able to conceive, and my mom has been getting anxious." He paused for a moment, glanced at me, and continued, "Then Sophie came into my life. We clicked instantly. She understands me in ways no one else does. And besides, her health is great. We were only together a few times and she got pregnant right away." It hit me like a thunderbolt. Sophie's child was his. At first, I had only suspected he might be having an affair with Sophie, but I never imagined they had been involved for so long. A coldness spread through me. "Derek, how could you do this? To me? To my father? I've been working so hard to improve my health for the sake of having a baby, it was only a matter of time. You couldn't even wait?" His expression shifted, and he took my hand, his eyes full of what looked like affection. "Emily, it was a mistake at first. Later, it just happened. Please forgive me. The doctor said you might never be able to have children, but Sophie, she had a boy. Our family finally has an heir. We won't pressure you anymore. Emily, let's move forward together. If you're willing, you can remain the wife in this family. Sophie will just be a concubine. We'll make sure you're never mistreated." I burst into tears. I would be the wife, and Sophie would be the mistress? Derek wanted to have his cake and eat it too. Where did he get the audacity? "Derek, get out of here." Seeing how upset I was, he stood up and hesitated, looking at me. "Emily, please think about my proposal." He turned and left without a backward glance. I didn't even want to ask Nathan about this anymore. It was obvious what he would say. In his mind, Sophie mattered more than I ever could. He couldn't bear to see Sophie or her baby suffer, so he used me as a shield. I couldn't believe I, Emily, had misjudged someone so terribly. How could I have fallen for such a heartless man? And Sophie? She wasn't any better. I had treated her as my closest friend, even prioritizing her over Grace, my childhood best friend. The two people I cherished most had betrayed me together. At that moment, I felt like the biggest failure, and I was consumed with hatred. During my hospital stay, Derek never came to visit me again. My mother-in-law, Ruby, didn't even check in on me. Having lost both my parents long ago, I was utterly alone during this time. After 2 weeks in the hospital, I was discharged and returned home by myself. That very same day, Derek came home with Sophie and their newborn baby. Ruby followed behind them, cradling the baby in her arms. Their faces were glowing with joy. When Sophie saw me in the living room, she looked visibly uncomfortable. I shot her a glance, and she shrank back, hiding behind Derek. Derek guided her to sit down, holding her protectively in his arms, as if my feelings as his wife didn't matter at all. "Emily, don't take it the wrong way," he said calmly. "Sophie gave me a son, so of course she'll be living with us now." Ruby, cooing over the baby, chimed in, "That's right, Emily. I know you're a reasonable person. Besides, you and Sophie were best friends. Now you're practically sisters. Isn't that wonderful?" I frowned deeply. I turned to Sophie. "We've been through life and death together. To me, you were as important as Derek. There are so many men in the world, why did it have to be him?" She avoided my gaze, unable to answer. I sighed. "I just want to know, what's on your mind now?" My questions were relentless, and she looked as delicate and helpless as ever, the same way she always did. For a fleeting moment, I felt like I was being too harsh. After all, I had always treated her so kindly, holding her close to my heart and speaking to her gently, but that moment passed quickly. There could be no reconciliation now. She cried in Derek's arms, and he immediately comforted her with tenderness. Ruby couldn't stand it anymore. "Emily, don't go too far. Sophie just gave our family a healthy baby boy. She's the real hero here. And you? You're just an orphan. Stop acting like some high and mighty heiress. Don't forget, in this house my son is in charge. If you dare to bully Sophie again, I'll make sure you're thrown out." I stared at her in shock. Normally, she was so careful and restrained around me. I had no idea this side of her existed. The entire family was full of actors, masters of deception. The emotions were too much for me. Even though I usually prided myself on staying calm, this time I couldn't handle it. I felt utterly drained. My head throbbed with pain. "I don't want to see any of you. Get out." Derek opened his mouth to say something, but Ruby shot him a sharp glance, stopping him in his tracks. She set the child in her arms down and stormed toward me. "Emily, who do you think you are to tell us to leave?" Watching her stand there with her hands on her hips, her expression as sharp as a knife, my head throbbed even harder. I had no patience for pretenses, nor did I feel like holding back my temper. "Who do I think I am? This house is mine. That's who." Slap. A sharp sting spread across my cheek. I clutched my face and stared up at her in disbelief. In all my life, except for that one time with Nathan, no one had ever dared to lay a hand on me. And now? She slapped me? Respect for elders? Forget it. I wasn't about to let this slide. Fueled by fury, I stood up, swung my arm, and slapped her right back. "I've been giving you some slack because you're older, but you've crossed the line. Do you think I'm some kind of pushover? Try me again, and you'll see what happens." She lunged at me again, but while I might not be able to take on a grown man, handling her was child's play. I twisted her arm behind her back and pinned her to the ground. She cried out in pain. Derek, seeing his mother in distress, didn't even think twice about leaving Sophie in his arms as he jumped up to pull me off her. But one sharp glare from me froze him in his tracks. Sophie, ever the opportunist, decided this was her moment. She wobbled toward me, all dramatic, and threw herself at my feet. "Emily, it's all my fault. Please don't blame Aunt Ruby. If you're angry, take it out on me instead." I shoved Ruby aside and slapped Sophie across the face without hesitation. This slap? It's just the beginning. If you dare to make trouble again, don't think I won't make you regret it. Tears streamed down Sophie's face as she clutched her cheek. She spun around and flung herself into Derek's arms for comfort. Watching the nauseating display of their affection made my stomach churn. I snapped, "Get out, now!" Derek gave me a long, hard look before finally speaking. "Emily, you're acting like a mad woman. Let's just get a divorce." I let out a cold laugh and agreed without hesitation. They didn't leave right away, though. After all, the divorce wasn't finalized yet. Instead, Derek moved Sophie into another villa on the property. That night, I picked up my phone and called Grace, who had been vacationing abroad for months. We hadn't spoken since my father passed away from a heart attack 6 months ago. Back then, she had warned me to be careful of Derek, but I dismissed her advice, thinking she was just biased against him. We ended up having a huge argument, and she left the country in frustration. Now, though, she was the only person I could turn to. After I finished telling her everything that had happened, she scolded me for being so blind, but her tone was filled with more concern than anger. When she found out that Derek had tried to gift me to one of his clients, she lost it. "How dare he? Is he tired of living?" she fumed. "Emily, hold tight. I'm coming back right now." The next morning, I was jolted awake at 6 a.m. by the sound of shouting and crying. Throwing on a robe, I hurried downstairs. Grace was back. She had a spare key to my house, and there she was, lounging on the couch, flanked by a group of burly bodyguards. On the floor, disheveled and trembling, were Sophie and Derek. Clearly, they had been dragged straight out of bed. They clung to each other, shaking like leaves. Grace, as usual, was not someone to be trifled with. In this city, there were 2 major power players. One was Nathan, the wealthiest man around. The other was Grace, heir to a family with a 100-year legacy and influence that spanned both legal and underground circles. If Nathan was a wolf in sheep's clothing, Grace was a lioness who didn't bother hiding her claws. People who crossed her never ended well. But she had her principles. She never stooped to breaking the law or targeting the innocent. 6 months ago, we had a huge falling out and hadn't spoken since. Derek must have thought our friendship was truly over, which is why he had the audacity to flaunt Sophie so openly. What he didn't understand was that Grace and I had been friends since we were kids. Sure, we fought and broke up all the time, but nothing could actually sever our bond. She was one of the few people in this world who truly cared for me, just like my father had. When Grace saw me coming downstairs, she immediately came over to greet me. I told them to keep their voices down, but apparently, these 2 lovebirds can't stop wailing. "Sorry they woke you up." She helped me to the couch and then turned to one of her bodyguards. "Hey, Mike, go whip up some breakfast for our little princess here." I stopped her. "Grace, I'm not even hungry. How did you get here so fast?" Before she could answer, Derek exploded. "Unbelievable, Emily. You snitched on me? No wonder this psycho showed up out of nowhere. You called her. Sophie just had a baby. She's still recovering. Do you want to kill her with all this chaos?" Grace's expression darkened immediately. Derek must have been feeling particularly bold because he continued to yell at me, even with Grace standing right there. I gave him a pitying look, which he completely misinterpreted as smugness. "Emily, you're heartless. Have you forgotten that Sophie once saved your life?" Grace couldn't stand anyone mentioning that incident from years ago. She gave her bodyguard, number 2, a subtle look. Number 2 immediately stepped forward and delivered a punch to Derek. He struggled to get up but was pinned down by the other bodyguards, turning into number 2's punching bag. The living room was instantly filled with his agonized screams. Sophie, who was sitting nearby, was petrified. She trembled uncontrollably, occasionally glancing at me with tearful, pleading eyes. Her gaze was still as pitifully wet as always, but now it was mixed with sheer terror. "Oh, I almost forgot about you, you little witch. Sophie, the only reason I didn't deal with you before was because Emily was protecting you. Otherwise, with all your sneaky tricks, you'd have been finished by me hundreds of times over." Grace's voice was soft and sweet, but to Sophie's ears, it sounded like the voice of death itself. She collapsed to her knees, crawling over to my feet, tears streaming down her face. "Emily, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." I wasn't thinking straight. "Please, for the sake of our past friendships, spare me just this once." I kicked her away. Grace brushed off my pants for me. "Number 3, hold her down." Sophie tried to escape, but number 3 yanked her by the hair and slammed her to the ground. Having just given birth, she couldn't even crawl anymore. Furious, she screamed, "Emily, you ungrateful traitor!" Smack! Number 3 slapped her so hard that blood trickled from the corner of her mouth. "You'll pay for this." Smack, another slap. "You, smack." She finally quieted down. Ruby came rushing in from outside. Seeing Derek's battered state, she charged at me like a madwoman. "Emily, you wretched woman. How dare you bring outsiders here to bully my son? I'll kill you." She was full of fury but didn't even manage to touch my pant leg. Number 4 pinned her down, leaving her sprawled on the floor, flailing wildly. Derek was barely conscious at this point. I glanced at him coldly. "Grace, throw them out." Grace responded promptly, "Throw all 3 of them out." Number 5 carried the baby over. Grace pulled out a syringe, took a drop of blood from the child, and handed it to number 5. "Take this and get a sample of that scumbag's blood from number 1. Run a paternity test. As for him, throw him out too." Number 5 left, and I looked at Grace in confusion. "Grace, why are you taking their blood?" She tapped me lightly on the forehead. "Oh, Emily, I've been telling you to be cautious about those 2 for ages." "I noticed something was off about them half a year ago. I warned you, but you didn't listen and even argued with me. I was so frustrated that I decided to let you suffer a little to see their true colors for yourself." She paused, then gently stroked my face with a look of regret. "But I never expected you'd end up pregnant and in such a miserable state." Feeling her guilt, I reached out and patted her head. "Grace, it's all in the past now. I used to be too sheltered, not understanding how cruel people can be. If you had continued protecting me back then, I'd probably have fought with you even harder. Only by experiencing it myself could I finally learn my lesson." She sighed, pulling me into a hug. Her head rested against my neck, and her breath tickled me. Her muffled voice carried a vow. "Emily, I won't let you get hurt again." I nodded softly. "Grace, I've decided to divorce Derek. After everything that happened, my feelings for him had completely changed. I truly loved him. For him, I was willing to lose my mind, but only on the condition that he loved me wholeheartedly. Clearly, he was tainted, not just his body, but his heart as well. In fact, over the past year, I had noticed the unusual relationship between him and Sophie, but I chose to turn a blind eye. One was the man I loved most, and the other was my best friend, someone who had once saved my life. Back in college, Derek inexplicably disliked her. He often urged me to stay away from her. At the time, they were always at odds, which left me deeply troubled. When Sophie returned, I arranged for her to work at the company, hoping to ease the tension between them. Little did I know that their eased tension would end up in bed. Sensing my gloomy mood, Grace lifted her head. "Emily, just leave him. But you need to make sure the division of assets is clear." I froze. I'd never paid much attention to money matters. Derek had always handled those things. So, truthfully, I had no clue about our family's financial situation. Seeing the blank look on my face, Grace could already guess what had happened. She sighed. Oh, Emily, when will you stop being so naive? Honestly, you're the type to get sold off and still help count the money. Number 2, I'm leaving this to you. By the end of today, I want a full report on Emily's assets. Number 2 nodded and left. I looked at Grace with admiration. The people under her command were truly remarkable. Although they appeared to be just bodyguards, each one of them was an expert in their field. In less than half a day, Number 2 returned with a report. All my assets had been transferred by Derek. Now the only things left were this mansion worth $10 million and the 20% share I held in Nathan Corporation. Originally, I owned 40% of the shares, but under Derek's sweet-talking tactics, I ended up transferring half of it to him. Now, most of the assets he transferred are under Sophie's name. I was trembling with anger. Derek had been scheming behind my back all this time. His devotion to Sophie was truly remarkable. Grace dropped another bombshell on me. Emily, there's something I think you need to know, she said. Our investigator just found out something. 5 years ago, it wasn't Sophie who saved you. In fact, your kidnapping happened because of her. I stared at her in shock, my mind reeling. It wasn't her. Had I been giving my sincere gratitude to the wrong person all these years? Grace handed me a file. Trembling, I opened it, and my world came crashing down. It turned out that the person who orchestrated my kidnapping back in college was Sophie's ex-boyfriend, James. James was a thug who, after learning about my background from Sophie, conspired with her to kidnap me for a hefty ransom. James was only interested in the money, but Sophie had bigger plans. They staged an elaborate act. After getting the ransom, James pretended to kill me. Sophie heroically stepped in and took a knife wound for me. Caught off guard, James fled with the money. It was a chaotic scene. I didn't have time to question why Sophie had appeared there. I used her phone to call the police and an ambulance, but the police never caught James. Later, when Sophie was resuscitated, I asked her why she had been there. She told me she was worried about me. She claimed that when my father went to deliver the money, she followed him but didn't leave the scene. Instead, she returned with James to the place where I was being held. When James tried to kill me, she said she leapt in to save me. I was so moved at the time. Over the years, I had always treated her as my savior. Now, knowing she was one of the masterminds behind it all, any lingering feelings I had for her vanished completely. Grace, help me, I said. Grace immediately called her legal team to assist me in dealing with the financial mess. Once everything was sorted out, we sent Derek a legal notice. In response, he sent me some photos and a video. They were nude photos of me, along with a bedroom video of us together. There were also some suggestive photos of me and Nathan from that night. Derek was blackmailing me. He demanded I finalize the divorce immediately. He wouldn't return the transferred assets, but he offered to transfer back the shares on the condition that I give him another $10 million. My hands trembled as I held the photos. He had taken them while I was asleep. He had even secretly recorded us in bed. Grace was absolutely furious this time. Emily, don't worry. I've already sent someone to deal with Nathan, she assured me. As for Derek, that scumbag, I won't let him get away with this. With Grace on my side, I felt a sense of security. Derek had underestimated Grace's capabilities. After all, she was a top-tier hacker. I went with Derek to finalize our divorce. The moment I held the divorce certificate in my hands, I felt an immense weight lift off my shoulders. Finally, we were no longer connected in any way. And that meant we could finally put our plan into action. The assets Derek had taken from me amounted to nearly $1 million. Knowing he couldn't outmaneuver Grace, he planned to flee the country with Sophie, their child, and his mother. The demand for the additional $10 million? That was Sophie's idea. After the divorce, Grace hacked into their phones and computers. Every piece of compromising material they had on me, the photos, the videos, was wiped clean. But we also found something else on Derek's phone. It turned out he had a penchant for recording his bedroom escapades. His videos with Sophie were so explicit they could rival Hollywood's edgiest productions. Sophie's phone revealed even more damning information. She had been in contact with James all along. James was the biological father of her son. After graduating, she had returned to her hometown to get married. During those 2 years, she gave birth to a daughter with James. James had squandered the $1 million ransom my father had paid years ago on gambling. He lost it all and fell into heavy debt. A year ago, he even had a finger chopped off by loan sharks. Sophie returned to the city last year with a plan: seduce Derek and siphon money from him to pay off James's debts. Back in college, Derek had tried to pursue her, but she rejected him. That's why they had been at odds back then. Derek, however, had never stopped having feelings for her. So when she returned, it didn't take much effort on her part to win him over. Derek truly loved her. Over the past year, he had spent at least hundreds of thousands on her, not to mention the majority of the assets he had taken from me. Knowing Derek's feelings for Sophie still stung, but it no longer mattered. The paternity test results were in. The child wasn't Derek's. Grace and I, along with a team of bodyguards, went to their current residence. Derek, thinking we were there to confront him, pulled out his phone and glared at us menacingly. "Grace, I know you're skilled," he sneered. "But don't forget, I still have Emily's photos and videos." Grace let out a mocking laugh. "Why are you shaking? I didn't come here today to beat you up." "Then why are you here, trying to steal my phone?" "Let me tell you, even if you take my phone, I've got backups." I couldn't help but feel a little sorry for him. Nearby, Sophie glared at us with open hostility. I walked up to her. "Aren't you tired of acting all these years?" Her face froze for a moment before quickly recovering. "What are you talking about? I don't understand." Seeing her stubborn denial, I shook my head and stepped back to stand beside Grace, smiling faintly. Derek pulled Sophie behind him, his face full of caution as he stared at me. One of my assistants handed over a file, which I accepted and promptly threw at Derek's face. "Don't worry. Today, we're just here to deliver something. Oh, by the way, any photos and videos of me on your phone? They're gone now." He caught the file but didn't open it. Instead, he quickly checked his phone. After searching for a while, his face turned pale. Meeting his horrified gaze, I spoke slowly. "You probably didn't know this, but Grace is one of the world's top hackers." His face went ashen as he realized what had happened. Panicking, he hurriedly opened the file. As he read through it, his face turned green, and the veins on his forehead bulged as if they were about to burst. From behind, Sophie couldn't see the contents of the file. Noticing Derek's silence, she leaned forward anxiously. "Derek, what is it?" Derek turned to her, his gaze icy and furious. Through gritted teeth, he spat, "Sophie!" Sophie was stunned by the rage in his eyes. Instinctively, she stepped back, but Derek grabbed her by the hair. "Ah, Derek, what's wrong with you?" "It's me, Sophie." Derek's eyes reddened as he slapped her hard across the face, one blow after another. Sophie tried to run, but Derek pinned her to the ground. He wrapped his hands around her neck, looking like he was ready to strangle her. Flailing her arms desperately, Sophie managed to grab a vase from the coffee table. In a panic, she smashed it over Derek's head. Blood gushed out as Derek touched the back of his head in disbelief. When he saw the blood on his hand, his gaze toward Sophie turned murderous. "You bitch, Sophie! You've completely ruined me! How dare you use my money to support another man? You slut!" His punches and kicks rained down more ferociously as he vented his fury. Amid the chaos, Sophie finally pieced together what was happening. Struggling to her feet, she spotted Grace and me watching the spectacle from the side. Gritting her teeth, she lunged at me with the broken vase in hand. "Emily, this is all your fault. I'm going to kill you." One of my bodyguards stepped forward and shoved her back. She fell right into Derek's grasp again. Panicked, she swung the vase wildly. "Ah!" A scream pierced the air as Derek crumpled to the ground, clutching his lower body. The broken vase in Sophie's hand was now lodged in Derek's groin. Blood pooled rapidly beneath him. Internally, I couldn't help but give Sophie a thumbs up. Who knew she had such fight in her? Grace and I, having had our fill of the drama, generously called the police for them and left with our bodyguards. Derek's injury was irreversible. He was rendered impotent and would never have children. Ruby was devastated. Sophie fled, but Derek wasn't about to let her off the hook. Unable to find her and recover his money, and now rendered childless because of her, Derek leaked her explicit photos and videos online in a fit of rage. When James saw Sophie's reputation destroyed, he took their son and fled. Crushed by the public backlash and abandoned by the man she loved, Sophie was heartbroken. In despair, she jumped from a building. James didn't get far. We handed over evidence of his past kidnappings to the police, and he was arrested. Their 2 children had already been sold by James to pay off his debts. We exaggerated Sophie's tragic downfall and spread it online, leading to Derek's identity being exposed. The police eventually tracked him down. He was sentenced to life in prison. Ironically, Derek ended up in the same prison as James. In prison, the two frequently clashed. One night, James stabbed Derek to death in the restroom with a sharpened toothbrush. We managed to recover all of Derek's embezzled assets. Ruby, left with no one to rely on, was devastated when she learned of her son's death in prison. She lost her sanity. In her deranged state, she resorted to begging on the streets. One day, she was hit by a car while crossing the road and didn't survive. As for Nathan, the man who caused me to miscarry, Grace made sure he went bankrupt. I eventually took over my father's company, standing shoulder to shoulder with Grace in the business world. "Emily, it's all over now," Grace said softly. I smiled, leaning on her shoulder. "Yes, I can finally start again."